Slave ships were designed and equipped to deal with African resistance. From the earliest days of the trade, it was obvious that African captives, terrified though they were, would seize any opportunity to free themselves. Africans sought to escape even before they reached the coast, running away from their captors when possible. On board a ship, however, escape became more difficult. While the slave ship was anchored on the coast, European sailors loaded captives sporadically until the ship was filled, or it was time to sail. The slave ship crew separated the men from the women and children when they were detained in the forts, castles, and coastal barracoons. This process of separating African captives by gender continued on the slave ships. The first Africans brought on board may have been allowed a degree of freedom of movement. As the number of captives increased, however, and the crew was greatly outnumbered, the ship became a floating prison. It was then that the crew used chains, manacles, and padlocks produced by tradesmen in Europe to shackle mainly the adult males, who were kept in batches and locked below decks as the number of captives increased. Generally, the women and children had more freedom of movement and were not shackled together unless they formed a threat to the crew. Despite the chains, shackles, and other repressive equipment of imprisonment carried by the captain and crew on all slave ships, Africans found ways of resisting. The weeks or months spent on the African coast, waiting as the ship filled with slaves, was a dangerous period for the crew. When the Africans were in sight of their land, and with boats passing to and fro between the ship and land carrying captives, open resistance was common. Approximately 1 slave ship in 10 experienced some form of African resistance, and the rate was much higher for vessels embarking captives in Senegambia, which had the highest incidence of shipboard rebellion of any African region. Shipboard resistance ranged from an individual act of defiance, an isolated act of violence, or a normally fatal attempt to leap overboard, to major revolts which descended into a life and death struggle between Africans and sailors. For example, the enslaved people aboard the Clare mutinied and successfully drove the crew from the vessel, landing and liberating themselves near Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast in 1729. Sometimes an onboard insurrection resulted in the death of the enslaved and their captors, as was the case with one slave ship with a crew based in Newport, Rhode Island, in 1785. Rebellions could sink ships, as the result of a major explosion or fire. More likely, however, African rebels were beaten back by the superior firepower and violence of the crew. Slave ships were designed to give the crew vantage points to bring their weaponry to play against the Africans. Other ships, and men of shore, rallied to the fight against rebellious Africans, and gory defeat was commonplace. Once defeated, African rebels were subjected to a ritual of grisly punishments and execution, all designed to illustrate to survivors and to Africans watching on neighboring ships the inevitable fate of defeated rebels. Faced with the permanent threat of African resistance, the crew had to be permanently alert. A piece of wood, a tool, or any physical object carelessly left within a slave's reach, could become a weapon. Even African children were distrusted by the crew, as they could pass dangerous objects to the men chained below the deck to facilitate escape and revolt. From the early days of the trade, though Europeans considered the Africans a profitable cargo, they were also a threat and a danger. The crew on all slave ships were outnumbered, often by a significant margin. Their control could not be maintained, and the voyage completed, without a reliable and violent means of keeping the ranks of Africans under control. Thus, to ensure the successful landing of their African captives, the crew used a repressive system of imprisonment, of chains, and guns aimed at the slave decks. Such a system, the sailors realized, was required to combat the threat to their lives from possible African rebellion. Before ending the video, let's first take time and talk about the history of resistance to slavery. If you're enjoying the video, subscribe, like and leave a comment. Resistance is the story of slavery itself. From the first moment of attack and capture in their homeland, Africans sought to escape from bondage. On the trek to the Atlantic coast, while bound together by ropes and other equipment, individuals tried to escape their captors. In the trading forts, castles, or barracoons along the African coast, men and women attempted to escape and fight back. Aboard anchored slave ships, before departure to the Americas, they tried to mutiny or flee. Resistance to slavery continued at every turn in the Americas, as well. Newly arrived Africans and their descendants fled from forced labor, harsh punishment, torture, abuse, and the threat of family separation, sometimes alone, sometimes with others. They sought reunion with loved ones, sanctuary in hills or swamps, or freedom outside the confines of slave society. Often, slave owners knew where enslaved people were heading and advertised accordingly for their return. Collective resistance could take the form of secret networks to freedom, as with the Underground Railroad in North America, or communications networks, as with those of black sailors and seamen working in 18th-century Atlantic ports. Established maroon communities in Jamaica, Suriname, and Brazil formed elaborate systems for defense, communications, and subsistence, frequently involving the collusion of those who remained on plantations. Rebellions plagued slaveholders and colonial governments throughout the era of transatlantic slave trade and slavery, most famously during the Age of Revolutions on the French Caribbean islands of Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. In Saint-Domingue, enslaved people allied themselves with various free people of color in the colony to transform their rebellion into a full-scale revolution that brought an end to slavery in French colonies within 3 years. The overwhelming majority of enslaved people in the Americas, however, did not revolt. Most learned to resist by accommodating themselves to a lifetime of labor and bondage. They developed their own means of resisting the demands and dangers of slavery, of doing what was required but knowing how to minimize the risks and dangers around them. Enslaved people taught their children important life lessons, including how to cope with the risks and humiliations of bondage. Scholars do not know how many Africans died in slave ship rebellions. They were numbered among the more than 1 million Africans who did not survive the Atlantic crossing. Most shipboard fatalities were caused by diseases and illness. The 11 million survivors entered the Americas physically and emotionally traumatized by the slave ship experience, by disease and suffering, by the deaths around them, and by the inescapable threat of the captain and crew. Through faith and resilience, Africans began making new worlds for themselves and their new communities, within the bounds of American societies bent on their coercion. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked the video, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment. See you in the next video.